Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jen. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Thank you for joining us today for the Lunch and Learn Connecticut Soldiers and the Incident on the Massachusetts, April 1865. Our presenter today is Karen Stone, and she'll discuss her book, Shipwreck on the Potomac, Disaster in Pursuit of Lincoln's Killer, which was published earlier this year. Karen was born and raised in Connecticut, and that is where she got her first museum job when she was in middle school. I'd love to hear all about that. She holds a degree in history from Gettysburg College and has a master's degree from Penn State. And she has worked in museums in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York. And she's been the museum division manager for St. Mary's County, Maryland for 8 years now. So welcome, Karen. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation to come speak today. I did a good bit of the research for this book at the Connecticut Center for, the thing that I grew up calling the Historical Society. Sorry. But did a lot of the work. You have a lot of the diaries of men that survived this incident and wrote about it, wrote about some of their fellows who did not survive. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share all this with you. It has always been said that not a single life was lost during the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. Can we go ahead one slide, Jen? This is said with pride, as it should be, but it's not true. Now, these men weren't actually hunting for Booth, but they were working to keep him, to help catch him in a different way. So in the 1860s, life on the Potomac River was quite different than it is today. And instead of the calm, open waters, the river was the front line of battle. The Potomac was the main lifeline out of Washington, D.C., and for the federal government, it was the dividing line between the warring sections of the North and the South. And for the people here in St. Mary's County, it was their source of livelihood and much of their food. And for some, it became their final resting place. Now, on October 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter was fired upon. President Abraham Lincoln issued a call to arms on the 15th, and the governments in the border states now had to choose a side. So Maryland's Governor Thomas Holliday Hicks opted to refuse to answer Lincoln's call. He wrote to the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, saying, "I think it prudent to decline for the present," responding affirmatively to the requisition made by President Lincoln for 4 regiments of infantry. They just weren't interested in participating in any way. So on the 17th of April, Virginia declared that it would leave the Union, which made Maryland essential to the defenses of Washington, D.C. Confederate batteries began to line the shores of the Potomac on the Virginia side after the Battle of First Manassas in 1861. And this created a virtual blockade of the river and put an end to steamship travel. Now, they didn't actually put up any kind of physical barrier across the river, so ships could have still gone up, but the federal government felt it was too dangerous because of the batteries on the shore. So this cut off the primary federal supply line and caused ships now to have to go all the way up the bay to Baltimore, unload their goods onto railroad cars, and then proceed to Washington, D.C. overland. So if Maryland voted to secede, the railroad supply line would also be closed, and the federal capital would be surrounded by hostile lands. On April 19th, riots broke out in Baltimore between Confederate sympathizers and the federal troops who were passing through on their way to Washington, D.C. So the next day, President Lincoln sent a message to both Governor Hicks and Baltimore's Mayor Brown, asking them to come to Washington to discuss the situation. Lincoln hoped to preserve peace here in Maryland, but Maryland requested that no more troops be sent through Baltimore and indicated that the incidents of the previous day at the riots were not to be considered hostile actions against the federal government in general. They were just defending their city. Now, at this time, the Annapolis legislature met only in even years, so it wasn't scheduled to be in session in 1861. However, Governor Hicks was being urged to call a special session in late April after the upheaval in Baltimore. So the General Assembly met. Normally, they met in the state capital of Annapolis, but it in Baltimore had been put under federal military control as a result of the riots. So they planned to meet instead in Frederick, Maryland. Governor Hicks continued to promote neutrality, hoping that by staying neutral, the warring sides would be forced to transfer the field of battle from our soil so that our lives and property may be secure. The Assembly voted 53-13 against secession on April 29th, not because they did not sympathize with the South, but because they felt they did not have the constitutional right to leave the Union. The Maryland Assembly tried to meet again in September. Again, people in the state were clamoring for secession, but Secretary of War Cameron wouldn't allow it. He said the passage of any act of secession by the legislature of Maryland must be prevented, and if necessary, all or any part of the members must be arrested. 1/3 of the legislators were arrested, which prevented a new vote and brought the special session to an end before it even began. And it riled up the people of Maryland even more than they already were. Postmaster General Montgomery Blair published a notice in the St. Mary's, Maryland Beacon announcing President Lincoln's interdicting commercial intercourse with the so-called Confederate States, which was to include written correspondence and, of course, the mail. And as like so many other times, the people of Southern Maryland simply ignored the order. They didn't care. So Lafayette Baker, who was chief of the U.S. Federal Detective Police, came to Southern Maryland intent on shutting down the mail service to the South. 3 companies of 100 men each from General Joseph Hooker's 3rd Indiana Cavalry accompanied Baker and were told to, if necessary, permanently occupy the area. They did occupy the area and stayed until the war's end 4 years later. Now, to combat illicit trade and to interrupt the enemy's communications, drive from those waters every hostile bottom, and protect loyal citizens, Union Naval Commander James H. Ward proposed a flotilla with a view to service in the Chesapeake and its tributaries, chiefly the Potomac River. The Potomac Flotilla was formed and arrived here on May 1st. And its main purpose was to restrict communication between Maryland and Virginia, to limit Confederate activity along the river, both on it and on shore, and to defend Washington, D.C. But the nightly smuggling of supplies to Virginia continued, as many of the citizens of both Charles and St. Mary's County, Maryland, were friends of the South. These people were watermen. They knew the water, they lived on the water, and so did the people in Virginia, which you can see from here across the river. These people were friends. They had married each other. They had property that they owned on both sides. They did not look at these people suddenly as enemies. They were just the same friends, neighbors, and relations that they'd had since 1634. So they were doing all they could to help. In April 1862, General Benjamin Butler arrived in Maryland because of all of this activity, and he declared martial law across the entire state. And yet, the Confederate sympathizers continued with all of the zeal they had before. Nothing changed. By 1864, the Potomac River had been laid out in divisions by the flotilla commanders, with vessels assigned to each specific area. They were to cruise their sections from dusk until dawn and lay at anchor during the day, but never in the same place 2 days in a row. No bells were to be struck at night, and on foggy or misty nights, the guard was to be doubled. With all of the unrest and illicit activity going on in Southern Maryland, it was only natural that when John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, The manhunt focused on this region, and the government called on the Potomac Flotilla for aid. On April 22nd, 1865, just 8 days after the assassination, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton issued the following War Department bulletin. The counties of Prince George's, Charles, and St. Mary's have, during the whole war, been noted for hostility to the government and their protection to rebel blockade runners, rebel spies, and every species of public enemy. The murderers of the president harbored there before the murder, and Booth fled in that direction. If he escapes, it will be owing to rebel accomplices in that region. The military commander of the department will speedily take measures to bring these rebel sympathizers and accomplices in the murder to a sense of their criminal conduct. The hunt was on, and the focus was Southern Maryland. The entire Southern Maryland peninsula was searched, but they found nothing of note. A call went out to increase the strength of the Potomac Flotilla, hoping to create such a dense picket line that no boat would be able to get through. And one of the vessels assigned to join the flotilla was the Black Diamond, which was one of over 600 ships chartered to the quartermaster department to transport supplies and men for the Army. It was stationed mostly at the Alexandria, Virginia quartermaster depot and was immediately available. So Black Diamond was sent to join this special force, not knowing that it was too late or that this would be its final mission. The Black Diamond was a steam propeller barge, 120 feet long and capable of carrying between 180 and 200 tons of freight. We don't have a picture of it, but it looked like the barge that you see here on the screen. It was chartered and put into the service of the quartermaster department in December of 1862, so served a good long time in the war. And the contract stipulated that it was to be used for the hauling of freight or to be generally available for hire as needed by the Army, which is where this position comes in. The captain was John Meredith, and the engineer was Joseph Husted, and the usual crew totaled just 5 people. Now, during the 19th century, the quartermaster department was not yet a specialized military unit with its own transport vessels. That's the way we think of it today. Instead, the department relied on contracted workers and also detailed soldiers to work on board vessels hired or commandeered for transporting troops and supplies. And these ships' contracts all stated that war risk was to be borne by the United States and that marine risk was to be borne by the owners. So if a vessel was damaged by enemy shelling or was captured, the government would pay. But if the damage was the result of a storm, pilot error, or collision with another vessel that was not an intentional act by the enemy, the responsibility was on the owners. And this was a standard clause in all contracts for vessels hired to serve in the war effort in the quartermaster department. Now, each vessel traveling the waters of Maryland was required by law to have a duly trained and certified pilot on board. It was up to the pilot to ensure safe passage to vessels entering the Chesapeake Bay and traveling up and down its tributaries in and out of port. This applied to the charter vessels as well as the vessels of the Potomac Flotilla itself. And pilots assigned to ships of the flotilla were paid $65 a month plus 1 ration a day. And they served as civilians, not members of the military. And these rules for pilots date all the way back to the 1600s and were some of the first rules put into place by the new government formed here in 1634. Now, the other vessel in this story is the Massachusetts, a side-wheel steamer capable of travel in the Chesapeake Bay. It also went by the name John W.D. Pence, which is what you see on the side of the ship in this picture. And that was the name it was registered under as a civilian passenger, both before and after the war. And it began working on the Potomac River late in the 1840s as a passenger steamboat, making runs from Alexandria to Baltimore with stops all up and down both sides of the river. And the owners were Samuel and John Pence of Baltimore. Now, the steamer was chartered for service as a troop transport ship on October 14th, 1863, and again served throughout the war. It was paid $100 a day every day that it was used. And it usually made runs from Alexandria and Washington, D.C., down the Potomac to City Point and Fortress Monroe, Virginia. There, it would stop, return, and pick up supplies again at City Point if necessary, and return upriver. Now, on Friday, April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln while he was watching the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. And at that same time, George Atzerodt was to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Lewis Powell was to murder Secretary of State William Seward. They were all to meet on the Maryland side of the Navy Yard Bridge and ride south together. Powell was unfamiliar with the city, so Booth had assigned David Herold to guide him to Seward's home and then out of the city to the rendezvous point in Maryland. Only Booth was successful in completing his mission, and only Herold met him to ride south, having abandoned Powell at the Seward house. The 8th Illinois Cavalry was ordered to southern Maryland on the night of the assassination, and one of them wrote that the country is so thoroughly picketed and searched that a rabbit could have hardly made his escape through our lines without being discovered. And yet they found nothing. The next day, Flotilla Commander Parker received word that the assassins might attempt to escape across the Potomac River, and that he was to permit no boats to leave until further notice. The flotilla was to search all vessels that encountered on the river and prevent any from reaching the Virginia shore. So in response to this news, Parker sent 10 gunboats and armed sloops to patrol the Potomac River with orders to seize every boat. He assigned another 10 gunboats to cruise the Chesapeake Bay, intercepting all boats bound down the bay. And he sent 4 fast boats to cruise along the Maryland coast and 7 boats to guard the coast of Virginia. He felt that the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay were being vigilantly guarded, but stated in a letter to Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles that twice the number of boats constituting the current flotilla could not prevent a canoe from crossing at night from Maryland to Virginia. He therefore called for more boats, intending to fill in the gaps between vessels and form an actual literal blockade, making it impossible for even the smallest boat to escape notice. By then, as Commander Parker was establishing his picket line of vessels, Booth and his co-conspirator David Herold were hiding in the swamps of Charles County, waiting for the right moment to cross the Potomac River into Virginia. Now, they were being aided by 2 Confederate agents, Thomas Jones and Samuel Cox, both of whom were well known among the people of southern Maryland. On Friday, April 21st, Jones heard a local man say, "I have news. Those fellows have been seen down in St. Mary's County." We're not sure if he was working with the federal agents or if he actually had heard that rumor. But either way, Jones knew that that would pull all of the federal troops out of the area and send them to St. Mary's County. So he went at dusk to the swamp to where Booth and Herold were hiding and told them the time was come for them to cross. You gotta go tonight. It was a damp and cloudy night with a gray fog rising from the marsh below the village. And the wind was calm, but had been blowing all day, and there was a swell on the river due to the flood tide. So at about 10 p.m., the 2 conspirators took off in the skiff that they'd been given and started on their way. But neither one of them knew anything about rowing, navigating, crossing rivers, or anything. So the strong flood tide carried them upstream and forced them back to the Maryland shore, approximately 12 miles north of where they had started, near the home of John J. Hughes, another Confederate sympathizer and agent who was well known to David Herold. Now, the next day was Saturday, the 22nd, And while Booth and Herold were resting from this failed attempt and waiting for their second chance, 300 Union soldiers were marching from Camp Parole, Maryland to Alexandria, Virginia to board the troop transport Massachusetts on the next day. And Quartermaster Lee was looking for vessels and men to send to the Middle Potomac to join the flotilla and keep Booth's crossing from happening. That's the Black Diamond. But they were too late. Booth and Herold were successful on their second attempt and arrived on the Virginia shore early Sunday morning. The Massachusetts was scheduled to make one of its standard runs from Alexandria to the Union stronghold at Fortress Monroe, Virginia. At Fort Monroe, the troops would transfer to an ocean-going vessel for the remainder of their journey south. And the men on this trip were to rejoin their regiments to complete their terms of service before either mustering out or continuing service as part of the occupying forces in the South. And as we already know, the Black Diamond was answering this call from Quartermaster Lee. So it received these orders also on Sunday morning, April 23rd, and they took on an additional 10 men plus a military captain for the guard duty on board the boat. And while serving on the Black Diamond, again, these men were employed and paid by the Quartermaster Department as civilian employees, not military personnel. Now, most of the men on the Massachusetts were recently paroled prisoners of war, mostly from Andersonville, Georgia, but a few had also been held in Danville and Richmond, Virginia. They all had been sent to Camp Parole, Maryland to prepare for their return to duty. A few others were returning from hospital stays and extended medical furloughs. Now, in the early years of the war, soldiers who were captured were held by their captors until an exchange could be arranged. But as the numbers of prisoners grew, the military had no choice but to parole them home. So the soldiers had their names entered onto a list. They swore an oath not to take up arms until exchanged again, and were sent home to wait for the call to return to duty. And this was known as parole d'honneur, or word of honor, and was a long-standing military tradition. But it soon became necessary to exchange prisoners right on the battlefields, as once these people went home, there was no way to get them back. Most of them simply disappeared and refused to come back when called. So they set up parole camps. And they all had names like Camp Parole. They were not very imaginative in their names. So they set up parole camps where you would go first, and then you would be sent to an official exchange site where you could actually then return to duty. And this all was created in July of 1862. So New Englanders and those from the mid-Atlantic states all reported to Camp Parole, Maryland, near Annapolis. There was another exchange site out in Ohio and another one down in the Tennessee area. So they were set up regionally. So you could at least get furloughed home for 30 days once you got to camp. Now, 15 of the 30 men who I've identified as lost from the Massachusetts came from regiments captured at Plymouth, North Carolina on April 20th, 1864. They were from Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. Now, 8 of those 15 were from Connecticut, 7 from the 16th Connecticut Infantry Regiment, and 1 from the 7th Connecticut Infantry. The 1864 Battle of Plymouth was the last major victory for the Confederacy. Union forces had taken the town in May 1862 and had been using it as a base for raids all over eastern North Carolina. But with the help of the ironclads Albemarle and News, Confederate General Robert Hoke laid siege to the town in the spring of 1864 and captured it, along with 2,364 Union soldiers. The battle began on April 17th, which was a bright and beautiful day. Oliver W. Gates, who was surgeon for Company F of the 16th Connecticut, reported in his diary that the soldiers lay in camp, none expecting an attack. But ere the day closed, we were surrounded by 12,000 Confederate soldiers under General Robert F. Hoke, CSA. Our little garrison numbering all told about 2,000 men. including around 436 from the 16th Connecticut. By noon of the 20th of April, the entire garrison of Plymouth was in the hands of the rebels, and all the captured were concentrated on the Washington Road, the main road out of town. Here's what one member of the 16th Connecticut had to say about it in a letter home. Dear Father, our regiment is in the hands of the Confederates after a severe engagement. I am all safe and sound, but awful dirty, with no chance to wash. I think we'll be exchanged soon. Don't worry about me. Write to me soon. I'll write again and tell you where we are in prison. Your son, Robert H. Kellogg. He was wrong about his exchange coming soon. The prisoners were relieved of their arms and equipment and issued 4 days' worth of rations from their own stores, which had just been captured by the Confederates, before settling in for the night. These rations consisted of 32 hard crackers and half a pound of pork per man. The soldiers were marched more or less every day until noon of the 25th, when they arrived at the railhead at Tarboro, North Carolina. They had come a distance of 13 miles. And at this point, the officers were separated from their men and were sent to different prison camps. Rations were distributed and included 1 quart of cornmeal, 4 ounces of bacon, a small handful of cowpeas, and a teaspoon of salt. The men were held in the stock pens at Tarboro until the morning of the 29th of April, when they were marched to the depot to take the railroad cars to Fort Sumter, Georgia, where, as their captors informed them, rations would be dealt out plenteously. They were going to Andersonville prisoner of war camp. They were crowded aboard small railroad boxcars and traveled through Goldsboro and arrived at Wilmington, North Carolina at daybreak, where they received more rations. A small loaf of soft bread and meat that was so spoiled they simply threw it away. Here they crossed the river by ferry boat and proceeded to Florence, South Carolina. And from there they rode another train to Charleston, arriving there on May 1st, which was a Sunday. No transports moved on the Sabbath, so they waited in Charleston for a day. The rations received there included hard bread and lean boiled pork, mostly ribs and backbones, which they declared to be very good. Another change of cars was made, this time onto open cars, and they headed to Savannah, Georgia. There they changed trains again and proceeded to Macon. They finally reached the prison camp at Andersonville at 9 p.m. the next evening, May 2nd, 1864. All of these details about their journey and the rations come from the diaries that I was able to read at your museum, which was really lovely. And they had to make all these train changes because the railroad lines were not standard in size in those days. So each time they got to a town or a large depot, they had to change trains to get on a different rail line instead of cars. Now, during their 5 arduous months at Andersonville, they watched fellow soldiers die of disease and starvation, get beaten to death by their fellows after over a scrap of food or a watch or a piece of firewood, be shot by a guard for stepping over the deadline, whether intentionally or by accident, and had come to hate those prisoners who agreed to work for the guards for an extra morsel of food. They also heard many rumors and suffered many disappointments about when their exchanges would come. On the very last page of his diary, which he kept throughout his entire time of service, Surgeon Oliver Gates wrote a statement of apology for his earlier remarks about those prisoners who had worked for extra food. He said, "I have made some errors in my estimate of the motive that prompted the action of certain of my companions. I was honest in my opinion at the time I wrote, but did not know what were the circumstances that were controlling their action. We looked upon them as the next thing to traitors, but afterward we were glad to accept the same condition ourselves. It turns out that they were actually helping nurse and care for the many sick prisoners being treated outside the stockade. They weren't helping the guards, they were helping their fellows." Now, finally, on September 1st, they learned they were to be paroled and exchanged. The detachments began leaving on September 7th. Some of the men from the 16th Connecticut left on the 8th, others on the 11th, and those that had been too sick were at last taken out on the 15th to begin their long journey north. The first group reached Fort Monroe at about 1 a.m. on December 16th, having made good time up the Chesapeake Bay in a smooth sea, and they made Annapolis, Maryland just before dark. All of the parolees passed through Charleston, and many were there during the bombardment of the city by federal gunboats. From Charleston, they were moved to the stockade at Florence, South Carolina, where some spent the winter. It was new and cleaner than Andersonville, and it had a better supply of fresh water, so they thought they were at least doing a little better. This group finally left Florence on February 15th, heading to Richmond, Virginia, where they were held until the 24th, when they finally received word that they were actually being paroled, and they all took the necessary oath. And they were ready now for their final leg of their journey to Annapolis and Camp Parole. Now, as soon as the soldiers arrived at the docks of the College Green Barracks in Annapolis, they were met by men and women of the Christian Commission. These volunteers helped bury those that had perished during the journey north and helped move the others into hospitals and the parole camp itself. The soldiers were then given clothing by the Sanitary Commission. They also had their hair and beards trimmed and were taken to bathe. Their old clothes were steamed to kill bugs and disease and then sold for rags or were burned if beyond use. Samuel Grosvenor of Company B of the 16th Connecticut Volunteers wrote in his diary on December 17, 1864, "I had a splendid bath, after which I put on my new clothing and felt the most comfortable I had for the longest time." Sergeant Gates and Private George Robbins, again both with the 16th, also mentioned their baths and the new clean clothes they received. Sergeant Gates also wrote in his diary of life in camp, saying, "I cannot describe the tedious, long days at Annapolis before we receive our furlough to visit our homes and loved ones. We just sit around and wait to be paid." Now, while at Camp Parole, the men were nursed back to enough of a state of health that they could be returned to their different regiments and complete their terms of service. According to the military officials, if a man was able to travel, he was fit for duty and must go to a parole camp and prepare to rejoin his regiment. This was witnessed by both John Cusner and George Robbins of the 16th. Cusner took his furlough in Hartford and tried to get it extended so he could spend some time in New Haven too and more fully recover. But his request for an extension was denied because he was fit enough to travel. Robbins was ill, but not so badly that he required hospitalization, so he was sent home to Plainville, Connecticut for his 30-day furlough. Now, the local doctor there requested an extension so that he could more fully recover his health, but it too was denied. He was told to report to the General Night Hospital in New Haven on April 20th, day 30 of his furlough, or be considered a deserter. When he arrived, he was told he was being signed back in for duty, but would be kept in the hospital on sick leave in the meantime. He refused to stay, saying that he'd rather rejoin his regiment and wait for his exchange with them than sit in hospital. So he left New Haven, heading for Camp Parole, and arrived first at Camp Distribution in Alexandria, Virginia on April 22nd. Once exchanged, the soldiers were moved from Camp Parole to either the Washington Navy Yard or Camp Distribution for transport back to their units. The group then that ultimately boarded the Massachusetts went to Camp Distribution on Saturday, April 22nd, which was a 6-hour march from Camp Parole. George Robbins met his regiment there at Camp Distribution, but was not able to get his orders changed in time to join them on the transport Massachusetts. So instead, he went on to Camp Parole, and that delay saved his life ultimately. The next morning was Sunday, April 23rd, more than a week after Lincoln's assassination. The Black Diamond was following its special orders to report to the Naval Depot at Piney Point on the Potomac River in southern Maryland in response to the news that Booth was in the area. When the Black Diamond set off down the river, the weather that morning was sultry, with a northwest wind which brought out the sun. The vessel traveled the 92 miles to Piney Point, arriving at 11 p.m. There, they received orders to join the picket line near Blackistone Island, 13 miles back up the river, where they anchored for the night at approximately 12:35 a.m., April 24th. The troop Transport Massachusetts set sail south out of Alexandria at 5 p.m. on that same Sunday evening, with approximately 300 federal soldiers from Camp Pearl on board. The men were bound for New Bern, North Carolina, by way of Fortress Monroe, where they would rejoin the regiments to serve out their enlistments. The water on the Potomac was calm as they got underway. But as the trip continued, the wind picked up and the water became very rough shortly after dark. The moon was just a waning crescent and had set, so was well below the horizon, making the night very dark. The men on deck of the Massachusetts were sleeping, many on the open deck, when they were awakened by a jolt and a loud noise. Traveling past Blackistone Island short before 1 a.m., the Massachusetts struck Black Diamond on her port side near the boiler, just aft of the wheelhouse, and opened her iron hull right down to the waterline. The Massachusetts also sustained some damage, but it was not severe. Her bows were stove in above the waterline, leaving a hole large enough to take in 5 or 6 men abreast, according to survivor William Knott of Company K, 16th Connecticut, whose account of the incident was published in the National Tribune in 1909. In the dark, all became panic and confusion. Many men on board the Massachusetts, who were awoken abruptly from their sleep, ran forward to see what had happened and found the bow filling with water. Some grabbed their coats, others their haversacks and equipment, and others went with just what they'd been sleeping. Now, Captain Calk ordered all on board to the stern in order to raise the bow out of the water and keep them afloat. And seeing the other boat come alongside and still apparently afloat, the men began shouting to it to come closer and rescue them. Now, according to one survivor, it was announced in a loud tone by some officer on board the Massachusetts to go on board the other vessel. Some complied, fearing that the Massachusetts was about to go under. Others jumped overboard into the water, grabbing planks and whatever they could find that would float. Some stayed put. The Black Diamond swung alongside, hoping to offload her crew onto the less damaged vessel, but instead, about 150 of the men from the Massachusetts started jumping onto the smaller ship, causing it to go down even faster. The men had assumed it was a relief boat and commenced to jump like a flock of sheep going over a wall after a leader. And in coming alongside, the Black Diamond smashed one of the Massachusetts' lifeboats, rendering it unseaworthy and leaving only one boat to assist with the rescue efforts. After the Black Diamond disappeared beneath the waves, the Massachusetts stayed near the spot until daybreak, picking up about 100 survivors in spite of the damage to her bow. Many of the survivors later related tales of being in the water for 3 hours or more, clinging to any bit of debris they could find and listening to the cries for help coming from others who had fallen or jumped into the river. Others wrote of watching their friends and fellow soldiers go down with the wrecked vessel. The Black Diamond's chief engineer, Joseph Houston, wrote that he was endeavoring to save George Carter, drummer, 16th Connecticut Infantry, but he was so benumbed that he could not catch hold of the line. Another survivor, George Hollins of the 101st Pennsylvania Infantry, gave further details of this incident. In his account, he says a drummer boy of the 16th Connecticut had been washed overboard and had grasped hold of the keel of the boat or something else and was hanging on for dear life and calling for help. One of the crew up in the rigging, who now we know is Engineer Houston, got hold of a rope and time again threw it to where the boy was, telling him to grab for it. The boy couldn't get hold of it. Every now and then a wave would wash over him and strangle him, and as he would emerge from it, he would call for the rope. He finally became exhausted and cried out to us that he could hold out no longer. He told us his name, George W. Carter. He said he was a drummer of Company D, 16th Connecticut, and asked us to inform his mother that he was drowned. He bade us goodbye, and as the next wave washed over him, he loosened his hold and sank beneath the waves. It was about 2 a.m. Now, George Hollands also wrote a very full account of the collision that was also published in the National Tribune in 1914. And in it, he wrote that he was among the first to jump from the Massachusetts onto the deck of the Black Diamond as it swung around. But he realized that it was severely damaged and that he had jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. So he returned to the Massachusetts. And in running towards the stern, he grabbed a stepladder off the hurricane deck, hoping it would keep him afloat once he went overboard. But at the last moment, it came to him that the river's not that deep. It's not going to engulf the masts and all. So he threw down the ladder, grabbed one of the guy ropes, and began climbing up towards the mast, where he found another soldier who had also thought the same thing. So they both were saved. Now, according to all of the survivor accounts I've read, Black Diamond sank stern first, moments after the additional men got on board, actually in less than 8 minutes and in 21 feet of water, leaving the cabin exposed above the surface of the river. William Knott wrote that the water struck the fires under the boilers as the ship sank and filled the smokestack full, creating a great dark hole in the water. I said, "This beats all I've ever seen," but I was saved once more, and I thanked God. There were other soldiers from the 16th Connecticut on board, including William Loomis, George Champlin, Henry Loomis, Charles Robinson, and Edward Smith, all of whom were lost. Henry Cook, Michael Welch, James Clancy, Martin Culver, Willard Sessions, and Claudius Marjoram, also from the 16th, survived. The one soldier that I've identified who was lost from the 7th Connecticut was Charles Bibbert. An article in the Pittsburgh Daily Commercial the following Wednesday reported that the Massachusetts succeeded in reaching Point Lookout, Maryland, in safety despite its being crippled. Everyone disembarked there, and when the soldiers were all counted, they found that they were 65 men short. The steamer Marion happened along and took on board some of the soldiers off the damaged Massachusetts, easing its load. And another passing steamer, Warrior, also took some men off the Massachusetts, including Private Martin Culver of Company A of the 16th Connecticut. And he wrote to his brother shortly after the accident that they finally reached New Bern, North Carolina on the following Saturday, the 29th of April, after a long and hard passage. Now, many newspapers of the day contained reports of the collision and the presumed number of dead, which ultimately was 87. But bigger events in the news overshadowed this incident, causing it to be nearly lost to history. On April 21st, President Lincoln's funeral train had begun its travels west, and its progress was being followed inch by inch in the newspapers. And on the 26th, the hunt for the assassins ended when Booth and Herold were cornered in the Garrett Barn in Caroline County, Virginia, where Booth was killed and Herold was captured and brought to the Washington Navy Yard. And then on the 27th, the steamer Sultana exploded in the Mississippi River, resulting in the loss of 1,167 lives. George Hollands recalled, "We watched the New York papers a few days following the accident for an account of it, but I never saw any mention of it. In those days, however, the loss of a ship and a few men was not considered worth mentioning." And even here in Connecticut, it received little attention. The Hartford Daily Current wrote a brief article on Tuesday, the 25th, noting that the loss of life will exceed 50. On Thursday, the 27th, the Current published this 185-word account on page 2 within a column of short stories. The names of the Connecticut men lost were not reported until the 29th in this short piece, also in the Current. Of the men aboard the Black Diamond, 6 were initially reported as lost, but ultimately it was found that 7 had drowned. Only 4 of their bodies were recovered, and all 4 are buried at the National Cemetery in Alexandria, Virginia. Compiling a list of the names of the men lost on the Massachusetts is difficult as they came from so many different regiments. Inquiries were made to the government as early as 1925 in an effort to find a complete list, but none was ever found. Among the 80 known to have drowned from the Massachusetts, I've identified 34 thus far, including the 8 from Connecticut. The other 46 men are not missing in the traditional sense, but we do not know who they all are. 37 bodies were recovered and were sent home. Some still lay on the bottom of the Potomac River. They did not go home, but they are now home. And they are remembered, even if we do not yet know their names. Now, since this incident fell under the Marine Risk Clause of the contracts, the U.S. government took no responsibility for it, laying it all at the feet of the owners and the pilot and captain. Assistant Quartermaster Lee wrote to the Quartermaster General on April 25th saying, "From what I can learn, the cause of the disaster was extreme carelessness of the pilot or master of the Massachusetts." He recommended that the captains and pilots of both vessels be arrested and brought to trial. Brigadier General Rucker and Secretary of War Stanton both agreed. Now, this was not without precedent. The legal responsibility of captains, pilots, engineers, and other persons employed on any steamboat for loss of life caused by their misconduct, negligence, or inattention to duty was first recognized in the Steamboat Act of 1838, which stated that vessel operators could be charged for criminal manslaughter for deaths resulting from misconduct or negligence aboard vessels in the United States. If convicted, the sentence was to be confinement at hard labor for a period of not more than 10 years. Vessel owners and public officers were added to the list of those that could be held criminally liable with the passage of the Steamboat Act of 1864. John Meredith, who was both captain and pilot of the Black Diamond, was arrested and held at the Central Guardhouse in Washington, D.C. Meredith remained there until May 6th, when he was released with a written parole, requiring him to appear whenever needed, presumably at the inquiry of the Board of Steamboat Inspectors. Captain C.J. Calk and pilot Charles Collison of the Massachusetts were also arrested and put into the Central Guardhouse. They too were paroled shortly thereafter. The 3rd Supervising District of Inspectors of Steam Vessels, which covered the Mid-Atlantic area, held an inquiry into this incident and submitted their findings to the National Board of Inspectors as a part of their annual report to the Secretary of the Treasury. The report stated that the board's investigation found that both pilots wholly disregarded the rules established for their government, and so both pilots consequently had their licenses revoked. And that's all we know. I have not found the records of the investigation. I would love to know why they came to that conclusion, but I haven't given up looking yet. Now, the widows and mothers of the men drowned from the Black Diamond were never able to collect pensions, as the men had been serving as civilian employees in the quartermaster department. But many of the widows and mothers of the men drowned from the Massachusetts were ultimately able to receive pensions, as those men were all soldiers. Could we advance the slide one, please? But in order to collect their pensions, those whose loved ones were not returned to them had to rely on the depositions of survivors who had witnessed the incident and the drowning to prove that they had died. No body, no pension. In some cases, the regimental officers were able to testify even though they had not been on board. Now, the mothers who had relied on the money sent home by their sons had to further prove that they had been dependent on that income. And that was often the town postmistress who attested to them for that, having handled each of the letters home. And ministers were called on to testify in the women's cases, proving marriage and the birth of the children. Clara Barton came to their aid as well when she approached Congress in 1869, asking that it make a declaration of death for all soldiers still missing and unknown, so their families could finally have closure and could seek financial relief through the pension system. The Alexandria Gazette reported that regular steamboat service on the Potomac River resumed in May 1865, and the town was happy to welcome several of our old Maryland and Virginia friends who have come to town, as in the old times, to purchase supplies. The Potomac Flotilla was put out of service on July 31st, 1865, and so the war was finally over in southern Maryland. On December 26, 1865, Brigadier General D. Wise suggested that the William Collins poem Ode, written at the beginning of the year 1746, popularly known as How Sleep the Brave, should be used in conjunction with any publication of the names of the soldiers lost in the collision of April 23rd, 1865. And another more specific poem was written for the 16th Connecticut by a daughter of the regiment, titled When the 16th Marched Away. We, the St. Mary's County, Maryland Museum Division, are doing our part to make sure that these men and their sacrifices are honored and that this incident will never be forgotten again. In 2020, Civil War Trails installed a marker in recognition of this collision on the mainland, just opposite Blackistone Island on the grounds of the St. Clements Island Museum. And the museum holds a wreath-laying ceremony annually in April to honor all of those men whose lives were lost on that fateful day. Local divers are attempting to locate the remains of the Black Diamond on the bottom of the river, and the search for the names of the other men continues. Now, since publishing my book, I've identified one more soldier who was lost during this incident, Henry H. Goodrich of the 2nd Washington, D.C. Volunteer Infantry. Also, since publication, I've learned the name of the pilot on board the Massachusetts, so I mentioned him by name today, Pilot Charles Collison, but in the book, he's simply the pilot. And in the book, the captain of the Massachusetts is identified as Captain Couch. I've since learned that the newspaper shown here, which I cited, was incorrect, and his real name was Calk, clearly seen on the arrest records and receipts. And some of the details of the men's trips home from Andersonville I learned on my recent research trip to the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, and that was my second trip there. So I did a great deal of the work up there in Connecticut, and I really appreciate all of that. And my work will continue until I have answered all of my questions. And I hear from people every couple of weeks who have read the book, and I have information to share. So I will continue writing and will keep updating as I can with the book. So now I will open the floor for questions from you or questions from the chat.
So much, Karen. That was so an amazing account, very detailed. Really interesting. Thank you so much. I do want to ask, while we're waiting for people to put their questions in the chat, can you talk a little bit about some of the research side of what you did, not just at our museum, but the types of documents you looked at, where else you've been able to find things that have been helpful?
Okay. When I took this position at the for St. Mary's County, one of my members had heard a little bit about this incident and suggested we do the April event. So in preparing for that event, I went online, where you go, you Google things to find things out. And there was nothing. There was about a paragraph that I could find on a blog, and came later to realize that most of what he said was wrong, but it gave me a start. So being a longtime researcher, I went to the National Archives and took my question there and said, where do I start? And they have, as you probably know, everything. So I was able to get copies of all of the records for both ships, their entire careers with the service, and some information about the incident, but no names. Absolutely zero names. So started looking for there was one notice about they had been released from camp parole. So I went back to prison records and went to the Andersonville records, and they have been very, very good about updating those to include what happened to the men that actually got out. It lists all those that died while they were there, but then those that were released, what happened. And so just by going through, and fortunately there are search engines, you can, go through the document and put in drowned, put in Potomac River, put in April. And I pulled up a lot of names that way, and it included regiments. So then I was able to go to individual regimental histories and get more information. And that's when I first came across the Connecticut crew, because the Connecticut regiments have been written about tremendously. They're huge volumes. And then that led me to individual historical societies and agencies where I could search their indexes online and see what they held. And that's when I came across the diaries and letters that you have. And newspaper records. I scoured, I have subscriptions to newspapers.com, plus all the ones that aren't on newspapers.com that you have to pay for separately, the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun and all of these, and just scoured the newspapers, which led me down some other paths. And that's where I found Captain Couch's name. And I was frustrated by him because I couldn't find anything about him anywhere else. And then once the book was published, a fellow researcher who is the expert on the John Wilkes Booth escape route and all of that, he said, I came across this little receipt in the provost marshal's files when I was looking for the records of when they arrested the other conspirators and put them in the guardhouse. And this says the guy's name was Calk. And sure enough, that opened tons of files about that captain. And oh my gosh. And I had not used the provost marshal's files because I didn't know I had any reason to. So I then went back to the archives to the provost marshal's files, and that's where I found that and I'd been looking for the pilot of the Black Diamond, and that's where I found that the captain also was serving as the pilot, which was kind of illegal because the pilot's supposed to steer, or the pilot is supposed to advise the captain. So you can't really advise yourself in that. So that might be why one of the reasons he was held accountable. But that's where I found his name and got that bit of information. And that led me down some other paths. So it really is a matter of just one door opens another door. And when I first was writing the article, it was published first in America's Civil War magazine. That's how this all started. And then I just kept working and working, and it became the book. But the very first presentation I did was right as COVID hit. So everything had gone virtual, but nobody knew how to do any of it yet. So I did a talk for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and it was on Google, and it was the most awkward slide thing. But CNN picked it up, and it had been recorded, and CNN picked it up. And I look back at it now and I think, oh my gosh, that's embarrassing. But as a result of C-SPAN showing it, one of the descendants of one of those killed contacted me and said, I'm not sure if this is the right rec, but I think so. So she sent me some of her ancestors' information, and I was able to verify that, yes, he had been on board. And that led me to a regiment I hadn't yet identified as having anybody on board, which led to some other names. And by reading the pension files and the applications, I got hold of other names, because when they took the depositions, if the body hadn't been returned, a lot of times just in speaking, they would say, oh, I saw Richard Smith go down at the same time I saw Andrew Jones go down. So then you get another name. So it's been years and years, and it's not over yet, but any little piece and bit has helped. I didn't even know there was a Steamship Historical Society when I started this, but it's up in Rhode Island. So was Googling looking for pictures, and they popped up. And so I have become quite friendly with them since doing this. And they provided me with the picture of they found where the picture of the Massachusetts was. They didn't actually have it. It was here in Maryland at the Historical Society down here, but they got me that way and have helped with some other bits and pieces of information too. So
What a puzzle.
it's just
Oh my
crazy.
goodness.
Yeah.
You could research forever.
Yes, yes. Well, and that's kind of what was happening. And my husband finally said, you've just got to publish this. It's never going to be finished. So just get it out there, because then people will contact you with more information, and you can write the second version. There can be a second edition. And he was right, because a lot of information has come forward because the book is out there now, and people are hearing the story and finding more information.
Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself if you'd rather do that than the chat. But please, if anyone has any questions, or anybody.
And if you think of something later, either Jen can give you my email address, or it was on the screen a minute ago. You can email me. I'm happy to respond. That's no problem.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. This was a whole new world. I learned so much. This was really, really fantastic.
Well, I'm really glad to be able to speak to Connecticut folks, because it is so involved with Connecticut.
What a
Yeah.
Connecticut story.
Mm-hmm. It is quite a
Absolutely.
Connecticut story.
Or even just the details of the escape of the assassins. I mean, that was fascinating. You don't normally hear all the nitty gritty of what they were trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
That was really
Yeah.
fascinating itself.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to wrap up today with a couple of upcoming events that we have going on. On Saturday, the 8th of November, we have Hannah and her daughters. The Connecticut Museum is partnered with the Glastonbury Historical Society and C. Leonard Raybon, who's an associate professor of music at Tulane, to bring you a concert that Raybon completely wrote the original music for. And it's based on 2 journals and other writings from our collection. The journals belong to Hannah Hadassah Hickok, and she was the matriarch of the Smiths of Glastonbury, and they were abolitionists and suffragists. And there was Hannah's daughters drew lots of attention in the 1870s for refusing to pay their taxes because they couldn't vote. So the music highlights Hannah's sayings, her poems, her childhood rivalries, her readings, and that of her daughters as well. So it should be a very interesting performance. This is not held at the Connecticut Museum. We are partnering, but the performance itself will be at the First Church of Glastonbury. And then on Thursday, the 13th of November, we have Sea Change Conversations, Building a Better Tomorrow. The presenter is Kathleen Biggins, and she created the Sea Change Conversations. It's to help people across the political spectrum understand why they should care about climate change. So she uses a technique of nonpartisan, science-based presentation to educate audiences on how climate change can impact them personally and why there's urgency to address it. So those are just a couple of upcoming events. Please feel free to check out our website, connecticutmuseum.org, for everything else. And Karen, please, if you find lots of new research, and please come back and talk to us again for the next edition. We would love to learn more. This was fantastic today.
Absolutely. There is another piece that involves Connecticut, the shipbuilder of the Black Diamond. It was built in New York for use in Delaware, but he had major family connections in Connecticut. And so there are records of his family records are out there. Some are at the Library of Congress, but some I'm sure are in Connecticut. That's a little rabbit hole I haven't gone down completely yet, but that's part of my next journey, will be to find his family records and see what else I can find. He was a naval engineer, an architect. So he worked with John Erickson on some of the ironclads, and in developing some really interesting propellers and other steam propulsion things, which were included on the Black Diamond. So that's another part of the story. So yeah, I'll be back.
Keep us posted and let us know when you're back at the museum researching.
Okay, I will.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot,
Have a good
everybody.
rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.